With a little more experience piloting my private spaceship, I next journeyed to Io, Jupiter's third largest moon. Images of it always fascinated me in childhood. It's slightly larger than our own moon, but unlike our moon, it actually does look like cheese, as the whole silicate and iron rock is coated in sulfur and sulfur dioxide. Caught between Jupiter and several other of its large moons, Io exhibits extreme geological activity caused by tidal heating in its core, as it's pulled in several different directions by competing gravitational forces. There are 400 active volcanoes on Io, which made themselves apparent as I pulled into orbit. I climbed out of the pilot's chair and opened up the glass floor hatch. A sulfur plume from an active volcano floated just under my feet, it seemed. The surface of Io was far more interesting and beautiful than I could have imagined. I got a cup of cocoa from the ship's kitchen and curled up with a blanket over the glass floor to just watch. Half an hour passed by when something peculiar caught my attention. One of the moon's dark spots revealed an intricate pattern. It looked like writing. It was my name. I stopped breathing for a moment, then scrambled to my ship's telescopic view to get a better look. It was my name, all right. Must have spanned kilometers. I'm ashamed to admit that my curiosity got the better of me. I climbed back into the pilot's seat, fired up the gravity drive, and began the landing sequence. The closer I got to the writing, the smoother it looked. It was a dark green, like some sort of molten copper that had cooled. At last, I landed, but I waited before turning off the gravity drive. An hour went by where I sat there, waiting for something to happen, feeling the rumble of Io's core and watching distant volcanoes erupt. Finally, I decided to get out and take a quick look around on foot before I left. I threw on a spacesuit, made sure it was sealed tight, and stepped through the airlock. With my own feet on the moon, I could feel that the tremors really were substantial. Maybe landing here was a bad idea. For all I knew, the ground under my feet was volatile and ready to erupt. I walked a little further away from my ship when something caught my eye on the horizon. The distant sun had me casting a very long shadow, but something was deeply wrong with it. My shadow was flickering. Its effigy of my own body moved strangely. I glanced back at the sun, but no clouds were passing in front of it. My shadow was uneven now. My arms pumped individually. My shadow looked like it was sprinting. At its end, about where my head should have been, a dark figure was running towards me. I took one last moment to look at it. It was humanoid and featureless. That was enough. I sprinted back to my ship. I made it into the airlock and slammed it closed behind me. My shadows looked normal from each of the 4 lights in the corners, and as I peered back out the window, whatever that dark figure was gone. But just as I started to breathe a sigh of relief, I heard a clamor in the cockpit of the ship. Ugh, how does stuff keep getting aboard? I wondered, exasperated. I approached the airlock's internal window and peered inside. I was alarmed as it made no attempt to hide itself. Another humanoid mass, although this one seemed to have more substance. It was an ashen yellow-gray, and it looked to be made of the volcanic debris of Io. Down the hallway, it stood over the glass floor of the cockpit before slowly taking steps towards me. I keep a hunting knife in a small sheath strapped to the thigh of my spacesuit. I opened the airlock, and it kept taking slow steps towards me. I stabbed at it with the hunting knife, but the swings only seemed to phase through. The only sound was volcanic dust crinkling against the blade. I retreated as it continued walking towards me, and backed myself into the airlock with it. I had a plan. It seemed like at least I would be able to kite it away from the ship. The outer airlock opened, and the ash being followed me into the dull starlight. All I needed was to get it 10 meters away from the ship, and I would be able to sprint past it to the airlock and get it closed in time. What was that? Something caught my peripheral vision as the sprinting shadow merged with my own. As it did so, the ash being became more animated. It bounded out of its slow pace towards me. I cocked my arm back and decked it in the face, and my hand burst into flame. There was a crater in the ash of its face, dust which now coated the glove of my spacesuit. I sprinted back to the airlock with my hand in agony, and once again got the door closed in the nick of time. Luckily, the airlock is equipped with a full room fire extinguisher. I hit that button and the powdered CO2 was released. The fire was out, but the damage was done. My skin was covered in third-degree burns and in places had fused with the spacesuit, but I wasn't out of the woods yet. I didn't bother removing my suit, instead marching into the cockpit and starting up the gravity drive. I lifted off, climbing higher and higher into the atmosphere, when I spotted a strange small shadow on the ground. This one looked like another ship flying overhead, but it had vanished as soon as I noticed it. My hand was throbbing once I was safely in orbit. I put the ship on autopilot back to Earth, and as we slowly started making our way back, I headed into the medbay. Robotic arms in the medbay helped me get my spacesuit off and began treating my wound. The cleaning and debriding was excruciatingly painful, but just as the cleaning finished, an emergency alert from the ship's AI played over the intercom. A projectile from Io was quickly approaching the ship. It wasn't supposed to hit us, but it would come close. I nervously watched on the ship's rearview camera as an enormous volcano erupted, sending sulfuric debris into outer space. I guess that's what they mean when they say Io loses mass every year, I thought to myself. To my horror, something emerged from the debris. It was another ship, made of ash. My adrenaline went through the roof and I sprinted back into the pilot's chair. Bandaging my hand would have to wait. We were already moving at max speed, 25% of the speed of light, and somehow this new ash being was keeping up with me. I now knew exactly what would happen if it caught up. I would have to lose it through careful maneuvering. Just ahead, and several hundred kilometers down in the Z-plane, was our solar system's famous asteroid belt. I steered the ship towards it, and was there in no time. I was forced to slow down, as at the speed I was going I had no chance to maneuver properly. I chose an opportune moment to do so, just as I crested over the peak of a large asteroid. It took the ash being a moment to reduce its speed, and it sailed overhead into the distance, losing me. I circled around to the far side of the asteroid and traveled several hundred kilometers in the Y-plane, keeping the asteroid in the line of sight from where I last saw the ash being. I traveled 500 kilometers in the X-plane and then 500 kilometers back up in the Z. There was no sign of the being, and again I began making my way back to Earth. Not 5 minutes passed when the ship's computer told me something was fast approaching. Sure enough, something about the size of my own ship. Again, my blood pressure spiked as I realized I was going to have to destroy it somehow. I took a nosedive back toward the asteroid belt, zooming right past the ash being. I had my eye on one large asteroid. The ash being was right on my tail. I made my way full speed to the asteroid, planning to pull up at the last second and hoping the ash being crashed into it. 30 seconds until impact, a loud concussive noise rattled the ship. I must have hit a smaller asteroid that I didn't see. I was losing cabin pressure fast, and there was a gaping hole in the ship's kitchen. I sealed all the airlocks between rooms when an even louder bang resounded. The piece of my ship's hull that had been ripped off by the asteroid had collided with the ash being. In the rear-view camera, I could see the explosion, with multiple asteroids completely molten, flames dying quickly in the lack of oxygen. The ash being was gone, thinking it had fulfilled its purpose. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that story. If you haven't already, check out my book, Polyandry and Becoming the King of Hell. It's about a little boy who dies and then grows up in hell. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.